Okay, wonderful. So welcome everybody to the WAPPP webinar on how are Airport PPP managing to achieve sustainable development goals. My name is Jacques Follin. I am member of the steering committee of WAPPP, the World Association of PPP Units and PPP Professionals, and I share the Airport Chapter. This is the reason why I'm here today. WAPPP is the global home for public-private partnership professionals. The association encourages the development of PPP projects in the respect of sustainable development goals to achieve harmonious partnership between public and private sectors. Allow me to share some webinar technicalities with you and present the sequence of events. The webinar is being recorded and is scheduled to be finished by 5:30 Geneva time. We will make a recording available on the WAPPP YouTube channel, so everybody will be able to attend and to look at the the recording on YouTube. The chat function has been activated, but only for organizational matters. Please use the Q&A box, which is on your screen, below on your screen, for any queries. Questions from webinar participants are very welcome. We will try to respond during the webinar, and should that not be possible, we'll try to give replies in writing later on. I will present the roundtable, and then Melissa Penicat, who will be the moderator, will start the discussion and the roundtable. This roundtable will last approximately 60 minutes. After the roundtable, there will be time for questions, which will be answered by our panelists, not panelists, sorry. This webinar is the second webinar of the WAPPP Airport Chapter, and we've chosen to dedicate it to sustainability. Well, in the recent year, achieving the 17 Sustainable Development Goals adopted by the United Nations has become a priority for most major airports. And consequently, they have launched a lot of significant actions to address the majority of these goals. The current COVID-19 crisis has accelerated, perhaps more in the airport sector than in any other sectors, the need to integrate SDGs in the management of all airports in the world. There are many reasons for this, whether it be the global airport policy recommended by ACI, the Airport Council International, the various public obligations of each country in SDGs matters, but also the constraints imposed in the financing of airport infrastructures. But today it is clear that airport PPP frameworks are very little to take into account the obligation, fully the obligation relating to SDGs, and this leads to many questions. The objective of this webinar then is to discuss the axis chosen by airports in terms of SDGs, to identify the constraints posed, and to imagine how and why airport PPPs must integrate a logic of achieving SDGs. Now, I don't want to speak more. Let me just introduce our exceptional moderator, Melissa Penicat. And Melissa is Managing Director at the Institute for Sustainable Infrastructure. This organization is known for its sustainable infrastructure framework and rating system called Envision. Melissa is an expert in the development, implementation, and administration of sustainability standards, framework, and rating systems. Since 2016, Melissa has led the Envision Project Certification Program, which has certified the sustainability of more than 110 projects worth $106 billion in infrastructure development. In addition, Melissa co-chaired and led the development of the People First Infrastructure Evaluation and Rating System. She is based in Canada, and she is a member of the WAPPP North American chapter. So it's a great CV, great bio, and I'm sure that Melissa will be the right person to moderate this webinar on Airport PPP and SDGs. So I wish you a lively and enriching debate on this highly topical issue, and I'm pleased to hand over to Melissa. Melissa, the floor is yours.
And fantastic. Thank you so much for setting the stage, Jacques, for this fantastic webinar. on airport PPPs and sustainability, and particularly their pursuit of the Sustainable Development Goals. And thank you also for the fantastic introduction. So it's my great honor and pleasure to be co-moderating the session with you and to be joined by such an esteemed group of panelists. And I look forward to engaging our panelists this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you're tuning in from, in lively discussion and debate about what airport PPPs are doing to achieve the SDGs and what is motivating them to pursue these ambitious goals. So the airport sector is an important one for us at the Institute for Sustainable Infrastructure. And over the past few years in particular, we've been seeing the sector make huge strides towards reducing environmental impacts and exploring ways to improve performance across numerous social indicators as well. So even in the midst of the turmoil and uncertainty of 2020, we were heartened to see the sector continue to commit to the achievement of sustainability, environmental justice, and resilience goals. So I'm looking forward to hearing from our panelists and to see if the same trends we're seeing at the Institute are consistent with their observations and experiences as well. So now we've got quite a group of panelists, so bear with me. All of them deserve a great introduction, and all of them have very impressive CVs. So with no further ado, I'd like to introduce them one by one. So today we are joined by Jill Doucette, who is CEO of SDGs Enterprise. She's a senior expert in sustainability and environmental improvement solutions. She founded Synergy Enterprises in 2008 after studying biology and clean technology at the University of Victoria in British Columbia. Passionate about how business, industry, and communities can mobilize towards a low carbon future, Jill works on the frontier of a number of sectors, including aviation, marine ports, tourism, and clean technology. Jill was one of the first airport carbon accreditation verifiers in Canada and currently works with airports across the globe to develop sustainability plans, emission reduction strategies, and clean energy solutions. She's an active writer and speaker with 3 published books and is also executive director of the Synergy Foundation, which focuses on clean oceans, circular economy, and urban agriculture, and acts as a sustainability expert for Modalis. We are also joined today by David Stanton, who is Managing Director and Co-Head of Ontario Airports Investment Limited, a wholly owned subsidiary of the Ontario Teachers Pension Plan. David has over 25 years of global experience in aviation strategy, finance, and operations. He is currently a board director for Birmingham Airport, London City Airport, and Copenhagen Airport. At Copenhagen Airport, he is deputy chairman as well as chairman of the Copenhagen Airport Audit and Risk Committee. At London City Airport, he's chairman of the Health and Safety Committee. Historically, David has been a board member of Bristol and Brussels airports, as well as High Speed One, where he was also chairman of the Audit and Risk Management Committee. Roshni Vanderswan is also joining us today, and she works as Integrated Reporting Officer at Royal Schiphol Group, an airport group which covers Schiphol Airport and few conceded airports in the Netherlands, Brisbane Airport in Australia, and T4 at JFK Airport in New York City. Within this role, she manages ESG, engages with investors and ESG rating agencies regarding ESG queries, and she manages ESG work streams in sustainable finance projects as well. The ambition of the Royal Schiphol Group is to operate the world's most sustainable, high-quality airports. As such, the group has developed a sustainability roadmap to progress towards the 2030 goals of realizing zero emission and zero waste airports, among many other goals, which I'm sure we'll be hearing more about when she speaks. We're also joined with Shirkin Captain, who is Deputy CEO of TAV Airports Holding. He has a wealth of experience in airport and airline operations, privatization, and public-private partnerships and acquisitions over the past 20 years. Since 2003, when he was appointed as the Business Development Director of TAV Airport Holding, he has been leading the strategy, business development, airline marketing, research and development, and investment activities. He has been appointed as Deputy CEO to TAV Airport Holdings in 2013. Shurkin is also the chairman of the board of directors of Havas Group, formerly known as North Hub Services, executive committee member of TAV Georgia, TAV Latvia, TAV Macedonia, and Saudi TIBAH Consortium. Two more panelists to go. We're also joined by Andre Van Hoek, who is Principal Investment Officer with the Global Transport Group at the International Finance Corporation, which is part of the World Bank Group. He has worked with IFC since 2004, covering initially energy and later transport infrastructure, including airports across emerging markets globally. Since 2005, IFC has committed over 2.3 billion US dollars and mobilized financing for 30 airports in emerging markets. And lastly, we are also joined by Holger Schäfers, who is Senior Executive Vice President of Frapport AG. As such, he heads Frapport's global investments and management division and is responsible for the performance and growth of the overall investment portfolio, currently comprising 30 investments in 11 countries on 4 continents, including Greece, Brazil, Slovenia, Germany, Asia, and Turkey. Holger holds positions in various supervisory boards within the Frapport Group and acts as shareholder representative of Frapport AG. Since he joined Frapport in 2007, Holger worked in different management positions, including overseas in Bulgaria, Slovenia, and in Turkey. Now, prior to our what will hopefully be a very lively roundtable discussion, I've also asked Stefan Schulgen, an eminent airport expert who's carried out a recent study on airport PPPs and their view of sustainability, to make a brief presentation introducing the state of the art of sustainability in the airport industry. So Stefan, the floor is yours for the next few minutes.
Thank you very much, Melissa. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending where you are tuning in. So as Melissa said, I will share my screen now and give a very brief glimpse of the research that I did on ESG and SDG in airport PPP. Just bear with me a second. Okay, so I guess obviously you see all my screen, and I will take you through this. It will take 5 minutes and set the stage for our vivid discussion that we're going to have on this. So as mentioned, I have had the pleasure to look into this fantastic topic in the last year, 2020. You know, I was doing my executive MBA, and as I work in this area of airport PPPs, this topic of sustainability, in particular with private airport concessions, I think this was a very interesting topic. So I did some research in airports around the world. So obviously this topic is different in different geographies. In India, in France, in Turkey, Switzerland, as well as in Brazil, and among other airports participated in this research. I did a questionnaire with these airports, and you know, some glimpse, some crisp summary of this research I'm happy to share now with you. Just to also make the introduction, and just for everyone in this webinar, just to refresh the memory, obviously, of the Sustainable Development Goals. As you know, the colorful goals or the ring, I think is present for everyone. 17 goals, but I think more important is to mention that behind every Sustainable Development Goals, there are targets, different number of targets, and also indicators, which go very in detail for each of these goals. And obviously, you know, the PPP itself, I would say, is also a goal, because it's partnership to achieve the other goals. So it's kind of a catalyst to provide, you know, results in terms of 1 to 16. And in my research, obviously, I wanted to understand a little bit better in terms of PPP, these special contracts that we have and work with. How does this fit in, right? And this is an ecosystem with different stakeholders, and how is it easy to implement? Are there any forces behind it? And what is the recipe for the success to achieve the Agenda 2030 set by the UN? When I started my research, and I believe it's not just limited to airports, SDG and ESG, there is a jungle of terminology in this area, and I think this is quite interesting. And this slide will get a bit crowded, and this is really what it is about actually when we talk about sustainability. Obviously, it started in 1992, I would say, talking about doing business without having impact on the future generations. And it really got a fast forward in the last 15, 20 years. When it left the philanthropy area, and we have the principles, if it's the Equator Principle, Global Compact Principle, principles of responsible investment, and then 15 years ago the term ESG was used the first time. And then, as I mentioned earlier, in 2015 we had the 17 SDGs published by the United Nations. And now more and more terms are coming in, like impact investment, or you have the negative and the positive screening aspect of investors. You have thematic investment, where you look into areas of sustainability in different ways. And this goes on and on, obviously, with ESG. Other topics obviously also now becoming more important: CSR, CSV, triple bottom line, so on and so forth. Climate change, a big topic the last years. Resilience, especially now with the pandemic. We are talking about build back better. And another very important concept, also very interesting the past month, is the People First PPP. We also in WAPPP had a webinar on this in the past weeks, also for airports. I think this is an option, and I will touch base on this in a minute as well. Obviously, also very interesting in terms of sustainability is all the the screening, the reporting, the ratings. I think there's a lot going on, and there are different approaches to this topic. But coming to the core of itself, obviously, when we talk about ESG and SDG, as I mentioned in the beginning, there are different perspectives. Obviously, there's the government who issues, let's say, the PPP contract. There are the challenge itself. They want to launch an infrastructure project, but then obviously you also have the sustainable targets. So how do you combine that, right? That is very interesting. Obviously, then you have the private party, you have the investors. You can have either institutional investors or private investors. Then obviously, if you have an airport group, and we have panelists today from these areas, it's very interesting how to see the sustainability over the portfolio of your airports. And obviously also you have listed airport groups or also non-listed assets, which makes it also a bit different in terms of reporting. Obviously, PPPs, highly leveraged assets. So obviously lending is an important part. We have public and private lenders. And this is also very interesting to see how they work in terms of ESG and SDGs as a requirement actually for providing lending and making this business possible. Last but not least, then actually the execution of our PPPs, right? The SPVs, the special purpose vehicles, it can be a mix of fully private or even with minority public shareholding, and they actually live the sustainability in the airport as we know it. Just quickly here, obviously the SDGs, they can be connected to ESG. So ESG is rather the term used more in the investment segment, but the SDGs on the ground, I think this is one also key takeaway. You can actually connect it to any financial number of your airport business, right? So if you have energy efficiency or water efficiency, waste, etc., you can see here some of the citations that I use. It has always direct impact. Either if you do something or if you don't do something, in both cases, you're going to have an impact somehow. Now, let me just quickly explain the research questions before I come already to the results, and then we give the word to the panelists. So maybe also pick some of the topics here. In general, obviously, it is interesting to see PPPs are an arrangement for a limited period of time, let's say 10, 20, 25, or maybe 30 years. But sustainability, the concept obviously talks about future generations. So how does that actually come together? Make an investment now that maybe only just pay off when the concession is over, right? So this is kind of a concept that I wanted to look into in my research question. And obviously the investment perspective, and we have also investors today here in the panelists. So how important is it actually? Do you consider it in your risk management when you consider your WACC or other indicators for your investment? What about the importance for financial partners? So in my research, I saw, for example, many projects where it was a prerequisite actually that the company, the SPV, does something for sustainability to be able to achieve finance for their project, right? And then last but not least, obviously also the importance for the regulator. How can a PPP unit integrate SDGs in airport PPPs, right? So it might be the infrastructure or the civil aviation ministry with its objectives, and the sustainability agenda is maybe somewhere else. So how do you, join these points? So very quickly now, the research results. Very happy to see that all airports I have interviewed have a sustainability manager, either a direct line to the CEO or somehow linked within the company. And, a lot of initiatives are there, and the airports also proudly informing about it. So some airports actually try to attend all 17 or 16 SDGs, and others prefer actually to have a selection of 5, 6 SDGs. And work specifically with them, right? So a lot of environment, carbon accreditation, waste management, renewable energy, solar things, energy neutrality. These are the topics here. But we also see a lot in terms of social initiatives around the airport community, doing a lot of initiatives there. What they also try to do is to include the airport stakeholders, right? So airlines, ground handlers, helping them to decarbonize and do good activities in terms of the SDGs. Surprise for me, also a little is done in terms of noise reduction. Actually, that was something I would have expected, but my research did not show much in terms of that activity actually. Now, just coming here to the end, actually already, shareholders in the boardroom, they encourage the SPVs to implement these sustainability measures. Some lenders impose sustainability as a prerequisite as funding. As I mentioned, a green bond, for example, was also mentioned that this was one vehicle used. And now let's come maybe to the shortcomings or the interesting parts. And maybe the panelists can pick up on that as well. It's not yet standardized, the reporting on SDGs and ESGs. So what I also have monitored is not all do track the positive and negative financial performance of ESG, right? As I said earlier, if you do something and you have a saving, that's good, but do you also look into the matter if you don't do something, what is actually the financial risk associated to that? In general, it helps with the public perception of the concession. Doing good is recognized positively. It eases the PPP relationships. This is also a very clear outcome of my research. And also very interesting to see, and remember my initial research question, obviously you have shareholders who might not be in the concession for the entire period of time, but might look for an exit scenario after a few years. And I think they also look for that in terms of evaluation of the assets. Yeah, just to drive a little bit on the point I mentioned in terms of measuring. So I think this is also an area where a little bit improvement can be done, that there's an industry-wide reporting standard. Obviously, there are companies and standards who have that, but it's not applicable everywhere. And so it's a little bit hard to actually compare airport assets on the same standard. Yeah? And last but not least, as I mentioned also, the PPP units, right? So the government and they should look also into it, but obviously there you have the challenge. You have a technical scope, let's say build a terminal, improve passenger experience or another runway. But at the same time, you need to make sure that you achieve sustainability. So it still needs to be a viable project, and it has to be in a good balance. And I think one cross-reference here is the People First PPP approach. We also had a webinar on that, and I also encourage you to read more on that if you are interested on that, right? So that was a quick run through my research. If you are interested in more details, please reach out to me. Here's the contact to my LinkedIn profile. But without further ado, I'm really interested now to hear our panelists to speak on this topic. So over to you, Melissa.
That's fantastic, Stefan. Thank you so much for sharing such insightful and interesting comments. And my hat goes off to you, because I really just think that set the stage brilliantly for the rest of the conversation. And a lot of what you presented very much lines up with the questions that we have for the panelists today. And so I think it'll be really interesting to hear how their remarks correspond with some of your research findings. So maybe this can even contribute to your research today. So with that, I'm going to start with my first question, which really for the panelists, my first question really gets at two main things. One has to do with the motivation for achieving the SDGs and ESG more generally, and also whether sustainability is included as a critical issue in the plan of airports. So I'm going to start with Jill. You've been advising many airports worldwide and implementing their strategy to achieve their sustainable development goals. So I'm interested to hear from you. What are some of the main motivations or drivers to achieve them? And just before I turn the floor over to you, one quick reminder to the panelists. We've got a lot of you. You're all brilliant and have tons of insights to offer. So if you could limit your responses to the questions to about 1 to 2 minutes max, that would be great. And then we'll let everybody be able to share their comments. So Jill, over to you.
Thank you, Melissa. And it's a great question. We've actually surveyed some of the organizations we've worked with to better understand their motivations. And the ones that came to the top were really wanting to show leadership within the sector. The sector has a bit of a competitive nature. It's very peer orientated in terms of which airport is doing what and who's really top of their game in this. So I think that I have seen is actually the main motivation. I think airports have a lot of respect for one another and how they act. And so it's really important for airports who are leaders to also lead in SDG. And that has a ripple effect throughout the whole sector. So there's a little bit of keeping up with the standard that is maybe even a voluntary standard that the airports are just adopting because they know this is best practice. But also I think more broadly in tourism and transportation, the SDGs is something that they're starting to hear about. So it's this framework that is a common language where you can start to compare initiatives. And even if you work in completely different sectors with different indicators, you can relate around a shared goal. So that ability to develop partnerships. And the last two motivations we've seen is to, on the local level, develop more transparency and better community relations. And then finally to showcase their sustainability initiatives, make them transparent, and attract investments, capital funding, or new business relationships. So those were the top motivators.
That's wonderful, Jill. Thank you so much for those insights. And I've been making some notes. Doing the right thing, healthy competition, sounds good. So David, over to you. Ontario Teachers has built in the past years a significant airport portfolio of private airports, mostly in Europe. So I'd like to hear your perspective on some of the main motivations and drivers for pursuing or achieving the SDGs, and whether or not the SDGs is becoming part of the core strategy of airports.
I mean, the short answer is they are, and they have been for a while. But it's not just the SDGs as stated; it's the wider ESG agenda, and teachers represents well, the Ontario Teachers the good Ontario, the good teachers in the state of Ontario. But if I look at our co-shareholders at a variety of our airports, we have 5 European airports, and it's becoming a license to operate, a license to do, or has become a license to do business, quite rightly, by the way. So we are measured on it. We measure our airports on it. It's a main agenda item, has been for a number of years. You know, Copenhagen Airport is listed on the Danish Stock Exchange. Scandinavia, across Europe, is probably one of the leading areas where they focus for a number of years on the green agenda. So, you know, I think we are we're very focused on it, have been for a number of years. We participate in a range of different measures around it, whether that's SDGs or whether we have the GRESB survey that is a lot of people participate in. We have done it at times, but also it's not just measurements; it's actually hard actions and a strategy of how do we reduce our carbon footprint, how do we improve our governance, how do we improve our role as a key enabler within the whole social infrastructure of whatever country or city we're located in.
Wonderful. Thank you, David. And Roshni, I'm going to be interested to hear from you and see if some of the same motivations and drivers mentioned by Jill and David are consistent with the Schiphol group. The Schiphol group, of course, has a great focus on ESGs in Amsterdam. And so do the same concepts apply for you? And maybe you could share a little bit more from your perspective on this important topic.
Yes, definitely. I think that a lot of things that I've heard from David and Jill do sound familiar. As mentioned in your introduction, Melissa, as well, it is our ambition to operate the world's most sustainable, high-quality airports, and therefore implicitly ESG and the SDGs are highly relevant to our daily business. But I would say our motivation is mainly driven by the fact that we truly realize that ESG performance actually transcends the interests of Schiphol and concerns society at large. So basically, as David was saying, it really is becoming a license to operate. Sometimes we have a leading role in this and sometimes more of a facilitating role, but both are important. And sustainability is included in our strategic plan. We have developed a Vision 2050 in order to achieve this ambition. And this vision is all about balancing the quality of network, which is of course the core business of an airport, quality of life, which is more about the environment and sustainability, and quality of service, which is really about your customers and the service you offer. All this by the enabling factors of a safe environment and a robust organization. And the quality of life pillar that I'm referring to really concerns our sustainability strategy. And that strategy is really linked to several SDGs. And then one step further to achieve the sustainability strategy, we also have a roadmap sustainability in place, which is actually one of the major deliverables. So then it all links together as being part of our long-term strategic plan.
Wonderful. So you're not busy at all, Roshni. So Shurkin, TAV Airport Holdings has shown a significant expansion in the recent past. You've been building an impressive portfolio of airport PPPs in the last 20 years. Did TAV evolve to put the SDGs and environmental, social governance concepts more broadly as a real sort of central or strategic position, and also at the airport concession level? Could you share your perspective on that? And you're muted though.
Yeah, thanks, Melissa. Sure. Just to give you the update, we are a listed group in Istanbul Stock Exchange, and we are part of a wider group, Group ADP, which is another listed company in Paris Stock Exchange. So ESGs are extremely important to us. There are several sources of motivation for us. I would say that the first one is reputation. ESGs, hence SDGs are becoming more and more important for all stakeholders, such as governments, for the new PPPs to be granted in terms of private parties. It's also very important for the financial institutions who provide financing to airports, and it's also important to the employees. Having a negative ESG reputation would definitely make it much more difficult to secure new PPP contracts. It will be more expensive. It's not possible to benefit from IFIs on the financing side. And also it would be more difficult to attract the talent in the international markets. In terms of financial motivation, yes, we do have financial motivation, because when we apply the ESG and when we achieve the SDGs, we have more favorable financing conditions. We have access to incentives and grants. I'll come to some examples on that. And some ESGs also brings high return on investments, such as energy loss at building envelopes by covering the building's heat flows, or using LED lighting to reduce the energy consumption, renewable energy. All these helps us in terms of reducing our OPEXs. Lastly, it's talent acquisition and retention, which is also very important. The Y generation is very much inclined to follow the SDGs. I mean, the younger generation are more and more involved and more interested with the ESG issues. So to keep the talent, for the talent retention, we have to follow the guidelines.
That's wonderful. And it's true that the younger generations are certainly having a huge influence and impact on how business is being conducted in all sectors. So thank you for those great remarks. And Holger, not to leave you out, Frapport is one of the leading airport investors in airport PPPs worldwide. You're present in almost all continents. So how does Frapport manage to include the SDGs and ESG considerations in its strategic plan? Do you share similar motivations and drivers that we've heard from the other panelists? I'd love to hear you expand on that.
Thank you very much. I mean, I'm very happy that they're coming last, but I think I can still add another little view on these topics. I think I heard it's the license to operate. I'm very happy that we've had this for a long time. Why I'm saying this is, I think at least for us, we have a long history of following guidelines which maybe have not been so transparent in the past. So for example, just to give you, in 72, I looked this up yesterday. In 72, we started to incorporate environmental protection into our corporate principles. In the 60s, we started to do noise recording and started to speak about the issues surrounding noise. In the 90s, we started to incorporate environmental management systems which are certified by external parties. So while I'm just wanting to highlight this, it's in the DNA of us, and obviously when we are going and investing abroad, we're taking that kind of DNA with us. So obviously we impose also certain expectations on all the companies which we are invested in, so that, for example, also our airports in Bulgaria, in Ljubljana, in Greece, they are also following the carbon accreditation program, just as an example. But I think even more important, I think honestly, I'm convinced that achieving those sustainable development goals, not only for airports, but for all companies with a long-lasting vision and mission, they should incorporate all these strategies or these principles into their daily doing, because at the end of the day, this is important to run a successful company in the long run. So I think these are just fundamental principles which any company needs to follow. And I will come at a later stage maybe to why I think this is particularly important to airports. So at the end of the day, I conclude my comment with, that I think sustainability must be at the heart of all airports. As a group like Frapport, this is even more important. And at the end of the day, we continuously include these non-economic aspects in our management processes around the world.
That's wonderful, thank you. And certainly last but not least, Holger, so thank you for that. I'd like to, in my next question, dig a little bit deeper and really just hear from some of you some very specific or concrete examples of how airports are involved with achieving the SDGs, whether or not the SDGs are in fact a common framework, if you will, that's used to talk about ESG more broadly. And, you know, additional food for thought for the panelists who I'm going to ask this question to. You know, we hear a lot that airports are taking great strides to doing things related to the environment, so reducing environmental impacts. I was heartened to see in Stefan's presentation that looking after some of the social indicators as well is beginning to be a factor. So I'd like to kind of get a good mix and hear some concrete examples from an environmental perspective, but also a social perspective. So Jill, I'm going to start with you. In all of your experience, you know, how are you seeing airports specifically approaching the SDGs? Do you have some recent examples that maybe look at that cross-section of environmental and social?
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you, Melissa. We do have a recent example. We worked with actually our local airport here, Victoria International Airport, code YYJ, and they recently released their new sustainability plan. And like Holger alluded to, you know, there's been a shift between environmental management plans, which were mostly historical in nature in terms of the results. They focused on mostly just the E of ESG, but adapting the UN Sustainable Development Goals opens up the categories to which a sustainability plan addresses. And I think that's a really profound shift, actually, to look more holistically about the integration of these different SDGs. And I think any airport that plans to really include them into their, say, public sustainability plan or strategic plan is going to see that it's complex. There's 17 goals, they overlap, and you know, so how do you tackle that? So with the Victoria Airport, and it's a great example if you want to look at their website, if any of the audience members want to see how an airport can really integrate the SDGs. They have their categories, but listed the key SDGs that relate to those categories. So perhaps energy efficiency and climate action. You know, there's actually several SDGs that relate to that. And I think when you find initiatives that overlap the SDGs, those are the strongest initiatives overall. So just a couple of examples of how the SDGs can really kind of open up our line of thinking in terms of strategy and specific actions. You know, for example, perhaps life on land, that goal also doing, say, some environmental restoration, restoring creeks can also enhance the resiliency of the airport and reduce costs when it comes to stormwater management. So you start to see these overlap. And I think especially right now, one of the most critical goals is actually goal 8 around decent work and economic growth. That's going to be a very important goal to bring back and put at the forefront in the next 5 years. So how airports are going about this, I would certainly recommend that airports use goal 8 as a lens and create a long list of potential initiatives within the SDGs and look at which ones will have a positive environmental impact or a positive economic impact as well, because we are in a recovery period.
Yeah, no, that's really insightful. Thank you, Jill. And Roshni, maybe I'll turn to you and ask the same question in terms of what you're doing at the Schiphol Group more specifically.
Yeah, so maybe to start with that social part we were talking about. So in our sustainability strategy, we also have a pillar around communities. And in that pillar, we touch upon topics like air quality, noise reduction, community engagement, but also really, around goal 8, indeed, healthy and inclusive workspaces. So These touch upon SDGs 8, I think 11, but also 17, and then more social instead of the typical green ones. Because I must say, it's also what I see, that the aviation sector is often associated with the green ESG and SDG aspects, but certainly other SDGs are also definitely relevant to us. And then in a more general sense, I can provide a few examples of how we have implemented the SDGs at Royal Schiphol Group. So overall, and I think Jill was also providing this as an example in our story, that we've identified at company level 6 SDGs that are relevant to us. And I won't name them all, but these 6 SDGs we've also then specifically linked to our sustainability pillars in our sustainability strategy. In our annual report, we then also report on specific underlying KPIs that have been identified by the UN for each SDG. And then another example I think also mentioned already is we have a green financing framework, which we use to issue green bonds, and we've already issued a few bonds. And it really focuses on then some green SDGs. So we focused, we've linked some of the categories, like we have green buildings as a category and clean transportation. We've linked both categories to specific SDGs to also provide insight how, which areas we are impacting with our bonds. So these are some examples of what we are doing at Schiphol.
Wonderful. Thank you, Roshni. And Holger, I don't want you to go last for this question, so I'm going to turn this to you for your comments. Do you have some examples, specific examples about how Frapport is embracing the SDGs specifically, both social and environmental if possible?
Yeah, sure. As I said, I think we all know that airports are of particular interest when it comes to the public and the environment. So to give you a very concrete example, I think in 2014, we started to take over the Greek airports, and in 2017, I think in reality, we took them over. And it was very clear that these infrastructures were very worn down. They were lacking investments to bring them up back to international levels. But rather than going and investing it directly, we started to engage with the regional neighborhoods, also surrounding the airports, to listen to what their fears and worries were, to understand better what are their needs, to incorporate some of the things which were possible into the master plans, into the overall strategy. We try to purchase as much as possible locally and regionally, so also to support the business environments there, because obviously this has a direct impact on the employment, on the trade, on the growth within that region. So we try really to focus also in the small, so to say, on all these social impacts, which social and environmental impacts which airports have. Beyond those, which I think everybody is following about CO2 targets, reducing emissions, etc. But I think, as you asked for environmental and social, I think we see this as a very important topic due to the nature of airports and the public interest.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And David, environmental topics have been critical in Europe for years now. Airport zero carbon accreditation has been a clear objective for many European airports. So maybe you could shed some light in terms of how and when you started to consider the 17 Sustainable Development Goals as a framework, and share some insights from the Ontario Teachers' Pension Plan.
Well, I think what Holger said and Roshni said is exactly the approach we're taking across our airports, which really, I know you got all these, you have the SDG targets, but ultimately that shouldn't get in the way of hard actions that are being taken. So, we like Holger at all of our airports, we are part of a community, and we have to be cognizant of noise. We have to be cognizant of employment opportunities, of impact on the road network, on the rail network, etc. And I think the this has been going on as really in many ways, but Holger, I'm not sure I can claim to go back to the 60s, but I think this is, airports have been talking about this for many, many years. Now there happens to now be more labels that it's nice that you got all the various hooks and you can go and take your coat and stick your coat on one hook, or maybe you can go and stick it on a couple of hooks, or your hat on another one. But I think, I mean, this industry, aviation has not done a particularly good job in communicating over the years compared to other industries, the benefits or the improvements that our industry has made. And I'm not just talking about airports, I'm talking about throughout the supply chain. We haven't done a very good job on explaining all of the things we've been doing to try and improve our impact on the local environment, noise pollution, air pollution, whatever it is. And we need to do a better job. It's quite good now because we've got all these labels, so that does help us, and we can put our little coats and hats on these various hooks. But yeah, I can come up with new, I mean, I'm sure Holger, Roshni, Serkan can all do the same. We can all come up with a variety of different projects we're working on. I suspect there's a huge amount of overlap because, we're all all the airports are talking to each other, because there's no, why reinvent the wheel when you don't need to? And ultimately, it's all of us as an industry to come together. But what we're trying to do is focusing on some of the smaller things. It enables you to try and solve some of the bigger things. So sure, anyone can go and buy carbon offsets, right? And don't get me wrong, we've done the same. But ultimately, what we're really trying to do is reduce our carbon footprint. And that's where our focus has been. So we're trying to do what is becoming, I suppose, normal day-to-day things like solar panels. Well, 5-6 years ago, nobody was really talking about solar panels at airports. We're trying to do more of that. We're looking at various little projects that together can actually have a major impact. Yes, we're looking at finance, green bonds, sustainable financing. We've got to be careful though. And within teachers, we're talking about it is just making sure we're not greenwashing, because we don't want to be accused of that as well. So it really is some tangible things that we're looking at. And it's less worrying about whether it fits nicely into one of the SDG targets. At Copenhagen, we're focusing on 4, but one of them we're not focusing on, one of the targets, which is not one of our stated targets. We're listed, and so it's all in our annual report. But one of them is around community engagement. Well, I'll talk to Copenhagen now, because I don't know why we're not putting that up there. But we're doing a huge amount on community engagement, for example. So I think it's just getting that balance right on the communication challenge, but actually also on the doing challenge of actually doing stuff rather than talking about it.
Wow, there's a lot to unpack there, which is great. And one of the key things that you mentioned had to do with really measuring the specific benefits that you're getting out of some of these activities. So that is going to factor into the next question. But before I go into that benefits question, I would like to turn the floor over to Serkan to share your insights from TAV Airports Holding perspective.
Thank you. As you know, as TAV, we are operating under different PPP schemes at the airport. These includes lease agreement, concession agreements, other types of BOT type of investments. As an example, recently we have added Almaty Airport to our portfolio through an acquisition process. For Almaty Airport, we have IFC and EBRD fully funding the project, no commercial banks. And as you know, all these kind of investments requires a strong commitment to the regulators, because regulators consider these assets as very strategic assets, and it attracts huge attention from the regulators. Also, IFIs are, very much strict on applying the ESGs. To be in line with the agreement that we have with the regulator and also with the IFIs, the implementation is also very, very important. So we follow the guidelines. We need to do all the actions related to achieve the goals, and all these related agreements with the government authority and the lenders push us to achieve the SDGs all the time. As I said, we mostly work with financial creditors and also sometimes minority financial partners. For them, it's very, very important as well. For the financial success of the project, we need to have sustainable development goals. And maybe we can add it as a milestone to have the existence of financial partners, financing institutions that pushes us to achieve these SDGs. Also, as part of being one of the world's largest airport operation platform, we have internal goals for all our operations. I mean, we have targets, mission and vision for the group, which motivates us to achieve, to set the targets and achieve them. This is all in a nutshell. I mean, I'm stressed because of this 2-minute issue. I know that we're a bit late. I wanted to answer quickly in this way.
No, thank you. I think that you all are doing a fantastic job giving pithy answers to very complicated questions. I'll now move on to my third question, which really digs into the whole benefits issue, picking up a little bit on something that David was talking about. So I'd like to get into the benefits that you are realizing or expecting from having an ESG or sustainability strategy, and maybe some of the things to think about. You know, we've certainly heard about an improved license to operate. What about improvements in the overall management of the airport? So I'd like to pick up on this benefits theme. This question, and in this order, is going to go to David, Roshni, Holger, and Jill. So David, do you want to kick this one off for us?
I think we've to be honest with you, I think we've covered the answer to it. I mean, I think, yeah, the benefits of doing it, I wouldn't say there's a benefit of doing it. We have to do it. It's part of our, you know, in the same way as we have to ensure we have a healthy, our airports are safe and secure. And that in a post-COVID world, obviously healthy as well should be put in there. That our security is right. I think it's also these days, and has been for a number of years, the environmental concerns, the right governance, the right social impact, etc. The benefits are you're required to do it. Now we have freehold airports, so we don't have concessionaires, etc. But so what? I mean, we have a license, obviously, but ultimately, you know, our passengers, our airlines, everyone's requiring it, and we're driving it before we're being required to do it. So I don't think, to be honest with you, I'm not sure benefits is the right way of putting it. I think it's just something you have. If you're going to operate an airport or own an airport, you have to do it.
Fair enough. And Roshni, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think I interpreted the question in light of the benefit of actually linking it to the SDG. So I think the benefit in linking an ESG strategy or sustainability strategy to the SDGs, we've indeed already covered it, but I think it's mostly in that it's a universal language, and comparability among organizations and airports can be done more easily. Even though the breadth and depth of the adoption of the SDG differs among companies, it helps in communicating efforts. So I think that is I think the most important benefit. But I think also in terms of management, which you were getting at in your question, I think in a more general sense, ESG and therefore implicitly the SDGs have a prominent role in our ambition and vision. And I think what it created with us is that it actually caused us to use a new lens to look at value. So value is not only perceived monetary anymore. Basically, what we now have to measure our progress in a short term towards our ambition is that we have a top 8 TPIs within Schiphol. Basically, there are 8 KPIs, but only one of them is financial. 7 of them are non-financial, so they are about on-time performance, also CO2, reputation, employees, net promoter score, for example. So I think that having a sustainability strategy and aligning it with the SDGs, it contributes to the general evolution towards a notion that value is not only monetary. And I think that's an interesting shift in managing organizations in general.
David, did you want to jump back in? You raised your hand.
I think it was more the whether it's ESG or SDG or GRESB or whatever label anybody puts on it, it's about the actions that are being done. And from an action perspective, you know, all of those things can take place, irrelevant of how you label it. So from my perspective, I don't see a benefit, as a specific benefit of whether you call it SDGs or whether there's ESGs, because not everybody's going to do all of the SDGs. Not everybody can cover all of the elements on ESG, but again, it goes back to the action orientated parts of it. All of it is good, and each airport should do as much as they can. How you label it, frankly, you know, I think some people spend too much. There can be too much debate around how you label it rather than than what you're doing. That would be the only clarification. But I agree with everything that Roshni just said. But it's just a clarification.
No, I think it's a really important clarification, because at the end of the day, it really boils down to relevant, meaningful, concrete action in the context of your specific airport or group of airports. Absolutely, I agree with that. Holger, maybe I'll turn this over to you. You know, specific benefits realized at Frapport and in your PPP portfolio.
Yeah, before I come to this, I have a slightly different opinion than, for example, I think what David said. I think, you know, to be very honest, we're a long-term strategic investor. So for us, you know, measures or investments do not need to pay off immediately. And I'm also with Roshni that, yeah, there are a lot of non-financial KPIs which we're following. But we also, you know, we're aware that airports are somehow at the crossroad of the different expectations of stakeholders. And if you go through the expectations of those different stakeholders, and you look at the issues which you need to tackle, so to approach the issues of those stakeholders, you will realize that they are very close, or they have a lot overlap with following the SDGs. So I think there is an intrinsic benefit of following those. But at the end of the day, as I said, we're a strategic investor. I think with all those measures, there are either commercial benefits and or strategic benefits associated to it. And I give you a concrete example. In one of our foreign subsidiaries, we were thinking of investing into a new cogeneration facility. And obviously, when you're doing this, you would use it as a first device. And I think maybe 10 years ago, we would have really opted for it. But if you consider as a strategic or as a commercial benefit, those risks which come along with the CO2 emissions, and they're really horrible on those kind of facilities, you come immediately that you have a very strong commercial and strategic benefit if you opt for connecting another line to the grid, and maybe on the grid you get energy with a good mix of 50 to 80% hydro or solar or other resources and better green energy components. So I think at the end of the day, I think they're very strong intrinsic benefits following the SDGs, but there are also commercial and strategic benefits if you really consider risks into the equation.
Fantastic. No, thank you for that perspective. And Jill, I'll let you offer some final remarks to this question from your perspective around benefits that airports are realizing from your perspective.
Thank you, Melissa. And actually, I think you and David have already touched on this a little bit, but it's really important to while maybe taking inspiration from other airports, make sure that whatever whatever ESG or SDG strategy an airport is putting in place is very salient to your region. This is the small stuff where it really takes root. And just a few examples. One airport we worked with, they thought, well, zero hunger, what can an airport really do about that? I mean, we're so removed from world hunger, it seems. We're a transportation hub. But they said, well, what if our concessionaires and for the food waste at the end of the day, they're able to create a partnership with the food bank and create a pretty significant donation program. So that's one example in a local community, a very salient issue. Also a benefit, it's reducing their compost waste and reducing their costs. So great initiative, ticks a bunch of boxes. For an airport we worked with in the Caribbean, one of their really important biodiversity related issues is the illegal transportation of endangered species. And being an airport, they actually have a role to play in helping to educate airport staff about what to look for, how to monitor these things. So they've created a partnership with an international organization to put in some training for monitoring. So every airport is so different because every region is so different. And those concrete actions is really where the rubber hits the road and we can make some meaningful change. And I think where the SDGs provide value is it helps you get there. The SDGs for both of these airports help them think a little bit outside the box. And I do think it's that an airport, while aiming to hit every SDG is really important, I think it's good for some to come to the surface because those are really important in that region. So for those that are managing airports and, within this call, within the panel even here, managing airports in all different regions, it might be something to consider to empower those airports to say, these are the SDGs that are important here.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's really, really fascinating, Jill. Thank you for that. I want to actually ask Shirkin this next question because I'd like to dig into a little bit about airports managed under a PPP scheme particularly. And are there any mechanisms within the PPP scheme that really pushes management to achieve improved ESG performance or attainment of the SDGs? For example, from the regulator or from financing partners. Would you be able to comment on that? And I'm going to ask the same question to you, Holger, as well.
Sure. I'll come up with a very recent example. As I said, we just took over Almaty Airport. The financing is about to close. As part of the contractual agreement with the government, we are asked to have some sound barriers, noise barriers, and also isolation around the airport area, the houses around the airport area. This is by our contract. At the meantime, we also have the IFIs in. As I said, the benefit of following the SDGs is reputation is extremely important for sure. Also, we have financial benefits. Because if we are to finance this huge project with commercial banks, the tenor would have been shorter and the cost would have been higher. When we go with IFIs, we have to comply with their guidelines. We have to have the SDGs, and therefore we benefit from the financing part. Also for the lenders, we had many items as CPs to close the financing of the project for environmental protection, for social issues around the airport area, because usually airports are surrounded by cities, therefore they have huge effect on the social and environmental issues around the airport. Therefore, it became like a must for us to take care of the ESG. We have to have performance on our ESGs, and it pushes us during the financing, also our management during the operational period. So that's it, I think.
No, thank you. And Holger, how about for you?
Yeah, as I said, I think first of all, I think that we are putting non-financial targets to our management, and also following these SDGs, I think is a strategic advantage. So I think overall, we would not need the additional stimulation from the other parties, as you mentioned. But obviously, we see overall significant requirements from regulators and financing institutions. And I dig through some, to give you some concrete examples, I dig through some of the concession agreements and also financing agreements. Obviously, these include mechanisms, now I need to read it, compliance with environmental regulations and environmental requirements, social plans, social mitigation, improvement measures, compliance with social laws, and obviously equator principles, and I could go on. I think there are a lot of requirements, particularly to environmental, equator principles and social, respecting social laws in different kinds of guidelines. But obviously there are some of them they are more concrete, in others they're very generic. So there's a big range of requirements which we're seeing. But obviously, I'm also a big fan of having flexibility. So I think, and I think we'll touch base on this maybe later. You know, what are the downsides of including too concrete requirements in concession agreements or in financial agreements? But I think we see a lot of those requirements in the different agreements.
Mm-hmm. And actually, I'm going to stick with you on this one, Holger, because I'd like to ask you about any challenges or difficulties with airport PPP schemes in terms of achieving the SDGs. So are you running into any particular roadblocks or, you know, walls that are preventing momentum in any of these areas? And Shurkin, I'm going to ask the same question of you as well.
I think at the end of the day, I would not say we're running into roadblocks or something like that. But to give you a bit of a feeling what I say when where the difficulties could lie. So, for example, when you're entering into long-term concession agreements and financial agreements, and if they're very concrete measures you need to fulfill in certain time steps and certain moments in the future. And obviously, these are always built on the expectations which you have today. And obviously, this Corona pandemic is a very good example that things tomorrow could be completely different than you expected, but you may still have those requirements in those agreements. And you know, sticking to those requirements, for example, expanding a terminal rather than investing into green energy, you know, this can be a pitfall because you may not be efficiently using your resources because things have simply changed, and it can prove to be very difficult due to political environments or due to existing agreements where the other side is simply not willing to change things, to readjust your strategy to the existing environmental conditions and requirements per se at the airport. So I think these are the worries which I have sometimes is if you have very rigid requirements in those agreements, it's taking the flexibility you may need to face the uncertainty of the future.
Mm-hmm. Great, and Shurkin, I'm cognizant of time, but I'd like to bring you into this discussion as well.
Sure, I'll just complement to Holger. As you know, all PPPs are implemented through international and local agreements, and these agreements are mostly not in favor of investors. Usually they try to cover the government's rights. Governments usually try to put most of the responsibility to the investor. Before the PPPs are realized, most of the governments in the developing countries are not following up the guidelines, but once we are in, they want us to strictly follow the international law and regulations. However, the flexibility of changing those regulations are not easy, as Holger said. The force majeure items usually do not fully cover the investors, as the case in COVID. We are continuously losing money without any support from the government, but we have to take additional measures for the hygiene and for the safety of the passengers. Sometimes There is a need for additional CapEx investments imposed by the regulator. However, to recover that CapEx, we don't see guidelines on the grantor side. And all these reasons are actually having huge effect on achieving the SDGs. We have to be flexible to renew those SDGs which are subject to changes.
Thank you, Shurkan. Andre, I'd like to bring you into this discussion now. So I've got a two-part question for you. So one is, could you speak to the role that is played by financing institutions and banks in the achievement of the SDGs in the airport industry? And kind of the second piece of this, and I'll give you a little bit more time to address both, but how are banks and financial institutions planning to intensify their role in achieving the SDGs through airport financing?
Okay, thank you. Overall, I would say the financing of banks for airports has been quite critical. I mean, airports are capital-intensive projects, and so banks have been instrumental to support the construction and expansion of airport projects. And as such, I think had a positive outcome in terms of achieving goal 1 by creating new employment opportunities and improve connectivity for people and businesses globally. With respect to financing specifically to IFC, for any IFC financing, the project needs to follow IFC's environmental and social performance standards, which will also ensure that the airport reduces its environmental and social footprint, which has then also a positive outcome on various SDGs by requiring, by example, the efficient use of resources such as energy or water, proper treatment of wastewater, imposing noise limits, and then restoring livelihood for people that have been affected by the project. Very often, in a lot of the projects we've been working on, I mean, those IFC standards were already part of the tender documentation, which then could be factored in by the bidders for those projects. I think it's easier if they can be done before it's tendered than doing ex post, because that has an impact also on the economics for the investors. IFC, I mean, to promote also green building, IFC has a process, a certification process called EDGE, which can, for buildings, which can also help project access green financing and improve project IRR and visibility or branding. I mean, this was, by example, applied in the case of an IFC financing in the privatization of the 2 main airports in Madagascar, which helped lower utility bills by 1/3 and reduce water usage by 50%. Now, coming to the next point, with respect to how our financial institutions are planning to intensify their roles in the achievement of the SDGs through airport financing, I think DFIs, development institutions like IFC, will continue to support the airport sector given its critical role for social and economic development. This being said, I think more and more attention will be given to the climate resilience of airport investment, as well as their climate impact. And especially with the Paris alignment of the various DFIs, this is getting more and more attention. In terms of opportunities of how we can try to incentivize investors or projects to meet SDGs, I can see the provision of green financing or SDG-linked loans becoming a more common mainstream request of our investors, which can incentivize them to have a positive income, by example, on climate-related indicators.
Wonderful. And David, I think that the 2 questions that I just posed to Andre are also quite relevant for you as well. So the role that financing institutions and banks in achieving the SDGs, and really what are your plans to intensify your role in the achievement of the SDGs?
Well, I think it goes back to something that Roshni said, and it's something we're actively looking at is, and highly likely to actually execute on is the whole sort of green financing and how do we get banks who are keen or lend. It's not just banks actually, just financial institutions who are keen on lending, who have their own targets, quite right. To overlap with our targets to show that we're serious about the achievement of targets and the implications if you don't achieve those targets, which is one of the elements of the green financing. So it is important. There's active discussions going on. It's fair to say we're educating ourselves. This is a bit of a new market, maybe not brand new, but as a bit of a new market. That is developing. I've followed with interest what ADR did recently. I don't know whether the other airports represented have looked at it, but what they did was quite interesting on the green financing. And you know, we are in active conversations with a variety of our lenders who I have been talking to personally over the last few weeks as we've secured waiver extensions. Unfortunately, due to the COVID crisis, and now focusing our attention on what does the future look like and how do we adjust our financing packages and new financing packages to have an ESG sort of overlay, if you like, to ensure that we can be seen to be serious, but also it's not just being seen to be doing it, is actually doing it as well. And so that is it's a key agenda item, and it's one that is at the top of, you know, it's not just people I report to, but people way back in Toronto, and the you know, and for them knowing what we are, how we're approaching it. And it's not just aviation, by the way, it's across the board on all financing at the moment.
Thank you. Now I'm just paying attention to time, and I think we've got about 10 minutes left. Could you confirm that, Jacques? Is that right? Okay, so as this discussion has been unfolding, we've actually gotten some really great questions in the Q&A chat. So I think that, I'm not sure if any of my panelists have been seeing the questions coming in, but I think that we should turn our attention to some of those in the remaining minutes. So one of the questions that's come in is, are there performance-based contracts and PPPs for airports? On which precise KPIs? I don't know who would like to tackle that one, but I'll open it up to any of you, if one of you would like to chime in.
I think this is Horace speaking. I think there are performance indicators and KPIs which we are required to fulfill in any or of the concession agreements, but they're all different. Obviously, this is most of the time, it is also about restating that we have fulfilled the environmental laws, you know, so it's very difficult to give a very precise answer because obviously we have so many different agreements.
Absolutely. Does anyone else want to jump in on this one? Another,
yes.
yes.
Melissa, yeah, just I want to, I think this point is very important. I mean, we've seen in the concession agreement in the past, a lot of obligation, a lot of KPIs. I remember contracts with 15, 20, or even 30 KPIs, which are very difficult to achieve. But I think that in the future, we could imagine to have in some of these contracts, to have, I mean, key objectives and very precise objectives in terms of SDGs. I know that Melissa, you're working, and a lot of people are working on SDGs measurement. I know that all SDGs cannot be measured, but some of them could be certainly measured. I mean, I just want to add this question probably to Shakan or Gur, maybe to Andre, who are very involved in PPP, just to know whether they think that one day or another having key KPIs on SDG measured and followed in the concession contract.
Jacques, we do have it. Actually, again, I'm going to give the same example of Almaty because it's very, very recent. As we said earlier, the financing institutions are crucial stakeholders in our industry, in the airport industry. Therefore, it leads to the achievement of the SDGs, but sometimes we are too much pressurized by some KPIs. Lenders naturally ask for the best, but sometimes it's beyond our control. Again, as an example, I mean, we are by the contract, we are responsible within the boundary of the airport, within the fence of the airport. However, some requests go beyond the boundary airport, which needs coordination and collaboration with the state authority. So it starts a education process. I mean, the grantor do not want to invest. We are responsible from the area that we manage, but we are asked by the lender to get this done. We have certain KPIs for sure, but it's not only us to achieve the KPIs. It needs collaborative, efforts and investments, because it's for sure in many cases not in our budget to do some investment beyond the boundary of the airport because it was not calculated. So we need the government support. It needs flexibility, as we earlier discussed. I mean, KPIs should be there, but sometimes KPIs also should be rechecked or balanced between the investor and the grantor.
Holger?
Yeah, I was just thinking about something which Rosny said earlier. I think we need to be very careful because obviously some of those things can be measured easily. But I think, for example, the non-financial part is equally important. And it's very difficult to find measures to be established in contracts. So I think it is about finding other incentives, and I come back that I think there are a lot of them. There are commercial and strategic benefits to follow those, and not everything can be set as a requirement, as a number, because it may be non-financial.
Yeah. Just a question, maybe many of you can answer. Sorry, Melissa, but I mean, don't you think that regulation could be also a way to impose some the achievement of SDGs? Maybe David, I know regulation is a key issue for you.
I think regulation is complicated enough, and to overlay that, unless the regulator is going to do that with airlines and other stakeholders around the airport, I think that I don't think that would be a good idea, and particularly in a post-COVID world where the historic link between a number of the key factors of regulatory building blocks have potentially been broken for a period of time. I think the industry needs to, airlines and airports and other stakeholders need to work quite hard together in a collaborative way to ensure that that we get this industry back on its feet quickly, to ensure that we're making money to be able to invest in sustainable projects to improve or reduce our carbon footprint. Because whilst we don't want too many financial incentives, at the end of the day, if you're not making money, we're not charities. If we're not making money, you can't magic money out of nowhere to be able to suddenly invest in sustainable projects. So, I think to then overlay a regulatory part of that, I think would be one that I would struggle to get my head around at the moment. Maybe a couple of years ago, pre-COVID, maybe there could have been a different discussion. But I think don't share that thought with anybody, Jacques. I think it'd be better just to keep that thought to yourself, I think, for now.
Well, just a question. Audrey?
I think it's important whenever I looked at as to review a concession contract and you have KPIs in it, the first question I have always, I mean, is it this in the control of the operator? The problem you see in many contracts is that, you know, the operator, it's not really in its control. And then this creates an additional risk, I think, from a lender's perspective, is that if the operator doesn't control the KPI or doesn't have full control over it, it can be breached, and you know, you give leverage to the grant, and then in that situation. And those are sort of situations we try to avoid. I mean, I noticed Serkan's comment there on Almaty, where lenders try to have sort of a mixed responsibility of the KPI. But I think from in practical terms, this is sort of a slippery slope, and it's dangerous because it often creates unnecessary tension on the concession and gives leverage to one party over the other, which I don't think is always healthy.
So just cognizant of time, I wanted to chime in real quick and extend my very sincere thanks to all panelists today and all attendees. And Jacques, I'd like to turn the floor over to you for just a couple of closing remarks.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Melissa. Thank you very much to all of you. I mean, you made a great job, and it was a great discussion on airports and SDGs. I just wanted to tell everyone, including the attendees, that this webinar has been recorded and will be seen on WAPPP YouTube channel at any time. It should be posted probably tomorrow. And I would like also to take the opportunity of this webinar to tell you that WAPPP will hold its annual conference. It will be online, one annual conference on June 14, 15, and 16. And during this annual conference, on the 15th, there will be a special roundtable dedicated to airports. And during this roundtable, the Patrick Lucas, Director of Economics at ACI, will convey the ACI view on the airport PPP industry and his view on the PPPs in the airport sector. Thank you to all, and well, you did a great job.
Thank you, Jacques.
Thank you, Jacques.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.